Well, so good afternoon, everyone. And I think first, I would like to thank the organizer inviting me here. And I think also very importantly, thank for everyone to remain here until my presentation, because the last speaker is always difficult that I'm clearly standing between you and fun in the Maritime Museum. And so I'll try to make it short and crisp as much as possible. So today I would like to share with you the topic, which is a topic that I am working closely with the University of British Columbia. And so the topic, as you can see, is the attitude of Chinese port towards adaptation strategies to climate change impact. So first, before going any further, let me first distinguish the so-called, what exactly is the so-called climate change adaptation. When we think about climate change, I think many of us will be thinking about greenhouse gas CO2 emission control. So this is what we usually call climate change mitigation, so as to slow down the impacts of climate change and slow down climate change from happening. But when we talk about adaptation, it's more about to what extent we are adapting to the impact of climate change. So for example, a few years ago, if some of you might remember, there is actually a superstorm, a Sandy, that had been wiping out a lot of the ports and also other coastal facilities along the US East Coast, including New York City. And so to what extent, how are we going to plan for it to actually make the facilities more resilient? This is what we talk about climate change adaptation. So, but as you can imagine, climate change adaptation itself is something very diversified. And it's not difficult to imagine that different ports, different facilities, different places, the so-called impacts of climate change can diversify a lot too. So along the US East Coast, for example, then now we are talking about more frequency of storms, so that there may be more damage to coastal facilities. But if we look a little bit further north in Canada, for example, in Montreal, which is a port along the St. Lawrence River, they are talking about that climate change has actually made the St. Lawrence River's water level dropping so quickly that the ships cannot come in at all, so that now they are trying to talk about how to do dredging along the river so that ships can actually come in. But what I would like to share with you today is really about Chinese port or port facilities in China. And in fact, the story behind this is actually a lot of programs, and not including in Stanford University, civil and environmental engineering. They have a very pretty developed program on climate adaptation, of which they put a lot of focus on the physical engineering as well as the social science part. But actually, their program was originated from a very Chinese perspective, because they started to investigate this problem because of the fact that at that time, because of the Disneyland in Shanghai. At that time, when Disney was negotiating with the Shanghai municipal governments, the Shanghainese government offered the current location, the land that you should be able to build your Disneyland there. But Disney, the senior administration in Disney, they were a little bit skeptical, because they feel that it seems that the land was pretty close to the sea, and so it seems that it's also in a location that will there be flooding? I feel that flooding problem could be quite serious. But then the Shanghainese government insists that there should be no problem, and so what happened is that Disney, the senior administration, they do have pretty close relationship with the civil engineering scholars in Stanford. And so in fact, Stanford actually start their whole climate adaptation program, including port and transport facilities, because they first want to start to investigate whether the land that is offered by the Shanghainese municipality government is actually adaptive to any climate change impacts. And so I think just, again, very quickly, some acknowledgement to a lot of the work that I'm presenting with you is my student and also with some of my colleagues in University of British Columbia, and is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and it's still an ongoing project that will last for 4 years. We have just only completed 1 year, so a lot of the results that I'm sharing with you are very preliminary. Just basic introduction about impact of climate change. I'm very sure that most of you will have heard about climate change, if not all of you. And so you can actually see that there will be a lot of changes in terms of changing temperatures, etc. And I think in a Chinese perspective, we believe that such impacts may also cause significant economic loss and even loss of life, including China. And economic loss is generated due to poor infrastructure replacement or repair and other operational maintenance, as some of the speakers, earlier speakers today has mentioned about the relationship and the contribution of port to city, regions, and the local economy. And so one of the questions is that potentially if there are impacts due to climate change, which can be, for example, sea level rise, which maybe lead to flooding, maybe more frequent or more serious typhoons, etc. So we are saying so port is going to plan for it, but the question is that, in the first place, for planners who are going to plan for it, you do have a number of constraints. One is that what do you expect? What is the impact of climate change? And then, when you are talking about facilities like ports, usually the planning cycle of a port is approximately 5 years. You can say port, they have like a 20-year plan, but in fact, what they really matter and what they really do about planning is about 5 years. So, and then planning for anything, especially when you talk about physical infrastructures like seawalls, of course it involves capital investments. And I think, as I mentioned earlier and during the earlier discussion too, a lot of these terminals are also run by private companies, of which they have shareholders. They also have performance benchmark to fulfill. Then also the question about is, if I am committing financial resources and effort on a particular seawall, if after 5 years nothing happened, is it really a kind of benchmark that I can actually show that it is successful, or this is money well spent? Not to mention, of course, you have financial constraint on all transport infrastructure planning, and that is why it's set up as the stage, as the platform, that why we actually, before going to do any planning, it's important for us to first understand what is the attitude and perception of port stakeholders or port decision makers in terms of so-called climate adaptation planning, because this is important on deciding what are they going to do and how are they going to do it. And so some previous research that had been done, not a lot on China, admittedly, but there have been some research that have been done in North America and in Europe on this topic. And so there are some of these examples that there are topics that are research related to climate change impacts, nature of the vulnerability in the context of climate change, impacts on the marine systems. And so I think this is something that there is more and more attention, as that is certainly on, let's say, on the other side of the world, attention has been raised. And in fact, in the place where I'm located, in the province of Manitoba, actually they are pretty happy that climate change is taking place, because they feel that if the Arctic is melting, then there will be more ships going through the Arctic, and it generates economic opportunities. So, but anyway, I think let's focus back on China. As you can see, this is just a very simple map showing the so-called ports and port facilities in China. You may wonder why these are also port, because many of them are actually, they are also so-called seaports and river ports. along the river. And so I think immediately you can also see that it's not easy to so-called investigate or to draw a very general picture about what exactly are the perceptions of Chinese port stakeholders, because what these ports are likely to face, they could be very different from these ports that they are likely to face in terms of so-called climate change impact. So in the study that they are doing, which is the first step, is we first focus mainly focus on the seaport first. One of the main reasons is because most of the work that had been done on this topic in Europe and North America, most of them focus on seaports. So I think from our perspective, it's also not only that we do have some previous references, but also with the fact that it's easier to do comparison and identify what exactly are the issues on. And I think in this case, I don't think I'm going to elaborate a lot about the so-called impacts of ports, other than saying that ports in China do play a very important role in promoting the development of both domestic and foreign trade. And so resilient facilities is important, but I think there has been some data and information indicating that in forthcoming decades, climate change can lead to rising sea level, falling the level of water in rivers and lakes, and more frequent and serious storm surge, increasing temperature, extreme temperature, and weather. The only question here is that to what extent it actually affect or is going to affect Chinese ports. And so we do try to look at it, assume that climate change is likely to pose huge impact on Chinese port facilities and operations. And but work is very scarce. And so even until now in China, you can see that there are works that are in their strategic plans, they did mention about the importance that we need to adapt to potential climate change impact. But then, to what extent that things are actually doing and planning have been done, we don't know yet. And more importantly, how do port stakeholders look at the so-called climate adaptation planning? Before I go on, mind you that usually in port planning, when we are talking about environmental planning or so-called planning, adaptation planning for climate change impact, is usually done by the same person or by the same team with those that are doing CO2 or greenhouse gas emission. And so, in other words, that they are doing the same team, and there is generally a trend that they do like to make reference to the way on how I benchmark in 10 years' time, to what extent CO2 emission due to port operation will be reduced. There have been a tendency that they want to copy and paste, in a way, of these approaches on dealing with the so-called climate adaptation. So, but this is something that, whether it is an appropriate approach or not, it is another topic that we are not going to address it here. But I think what we want to state here is that what exactly is the problem here is, as we said, adapting to climate change impact by Chinese port is limited. And previous research indicates that the attitude of port stakeholders on climate change diversify between different continents and different countries, which including some work by Becker from University of Rhode Island, and in fact also some of my own research. But also importantly is that given the importance and growing of China in in global supply chain, whether Chinese ports are adapting to climate change impacts effectively will impose huge impacts on the global economy and social welfare. And so this is the research objective. What we want to do in this particular work is to draw an overall picture of the attitude of port stakeholders towards adaptation strategies identify and analyze the major factors that influence the attitude of port stakeholders toward climate change impacts and climate change strategy, and understand the knowledge and perception by Chinese port stakeholders towards climate change impacts and climate adaptation strategies. And this is simple research question. To what extent Chinese port stakeholders believe that adaptation strategies are necessary to address the impacts posed by climate change on port? And in addition, what we try to link with, and this is in the process of trying to do, is to what extent the perception is actually linked to the governance and the institutional system that govern ports in China, like Professor Wang earlier in his work. So institutionally, if there is a direction that ports are now agglomerating and trying to work together to become a port region, will this affect the way on how they look at adaptation planning? And of course, one you can imagine in North America, for example, a port governance system is very different from China, of which is very much is a decentralized system of which the main player in focus are at the municipality level, city level, or provincial or state level. But while in China, as you can actually see, although individual ports, they operate, but then you still see that in terms of the way on how ports were governed, when how ports were developed, the national government, the central government still play a very prominent role in directing how ports should develop. And of course, this as I will illustrate to you in the results later in this presentation, that this actually played some role on how they actually perceive and how on their attitude on how to undertake adaptation planning. So two hypotheses that we are drawing before going into the methodology is Chinese port stakeholders believe that adaptation strategies are necessary when the impacts of climate change will cause an economic impact loss on port and wharves of port organization. And secondly is port stakeholders believe that adaptation strategies are necessary when the adaptation strategies would reduce the vulnerability of port to climate change in the long term. What we try to do in terms of methodology is mainly two part here. Is first, we try to undertake a questionnaire survey of which so far we managed to actually get information from 20 ports in China. We start from the senior management officers of port authorities of respective port in China. And then if we get people filling up the questionnaires, and then we also ask them to recommend, who do you recommend us to try to invite to complete the questionnaire, who should we approach? So there have been recommendations, and then sometimes we also actually, my student, she also went to China earlier last year, and to do some face-to-face meeting to ensure that inviting them to actually do the questionnaire face-to-face, and then these are some of the you can see some of the officers, the positions of the respondents when they are completing the questionnaire. And so these are actually the ports that we managed to get information so far. But at the same time, for a number of them, we also try to conduct a number of in-depth interviews, and mainly the objective for in-depth interview is to hope that they can explain why we are why they have this type of recommendation. I mean, why they have this type of opinion, and or in the process of how they come up with their opinion and attitude. So we do also manage to get a number of ports that work with us on that. And so from the questionnaire, the data collected, we also go a number of statistical tests to ensure their objectivity. And so for the rest of this presentation, I just want to very quickly share with you some of the quick results, and also some of our early explanation on interpretation of the results. So in an overview, if we are trying to say what are the strategies coping with so-called climate change and climate change impacts by Chinese port at the moment, you can actually see that, that we have different particular issue that still quite a number of them, they say they are not too sure, but you can see that a lot of them, they already said, okay, we are already including addressing climate change impacts in our strategic plan. So, which is good, but perhaps one thing that we may want to pay attention to is also about this, like this bar, is that climate change is covered and kept in your budget. So it's only 15% here. So one interesting phenomenon that we can see is that a lot of the port stakeholders, they will say, okay, we were very well aware. We believe that it's important. We want to keep it into our, we are already including it in the strategic plan. But in terms of some real commitments like financial commitments, do you actually have budget on that? Oh, actually, most of them say, no, we don't. We haven't even thought about financially, how are we going to address it? And at the same time, it's also like, when you ask the question, climate change is particularly emphasized in the insurance of the port. Most of them say, okay, sorry, we haven't thought about it. And so when you look at whether climate change has changed part of the design programs and standard, climate change is highlighted in specific planning documents. So you can actually see still the number of port and port stakeholders indicated that yes, we do have it, but then, but even if this is the case, I still also want to emphasize that most of the ports and port stakeholders are still not very much really seriously thinking about it. And so we do ask them also, from your experience operating your ports, what exactly do you believe that, what will be the major impacts that climate change can bring to your ports? Some of the issues, damage to facilities, I think that is not very surprising. More frequent and changes in maintenance practices, I think that's also not very surprising. But then this point is actually quite interesting. Delay in shipping, congestion of ships in port and terminals and stoppages. You'll be wondering that. So perhaps if you have facilities damage, probably that, of course, there may be delays. But in this case, in fact, what they are actually saying is not really about facilities damage. One of the impact that they are feeling is they feel that in the past few years, what happened is that, especially the ports in the north, the weather becomes much more foggy, and when it becomes foggy, it doesn't have any real damage to facilities. But what it did is that it actually makes ships more difficult to get into the port and get into the wharfs, go into the harbor, and so causing a lot of delays. But the problem is that in a shipping network, when you go from port A to port B and then to port C and then to port D, when you have serious delay in port A, it also very likely it means that you will get delay in port B, and then etc. etc. But then A, B, C, D, usually I think perhaps maybe when ports get into port regions, maybe the situation could potentially become better. But if it is not the case, individual ports, in many cases, they do not communicate with each other as a separate entity. And also, for many of them, they regarded each other as competitors. So whenever there were any ships delays, they don't communicate, they didn't tell each other. And so in terms of coordination, there have been a lot of serious problems causing a lot of delays, but then the next port were not informed, and then another port afterwards were not informed, and so that all the delay, it has become kind of a chain effect throughout the whole shipping network. But what we also try to do is we also based on the collected data, we also try to undergo a number of statistical testing. While I'm not going to really show all the detail of the statistics and the data because I admitted that we are not 100% confirmed yet, but we do seem to indicate that first, the so-called this hypothesis that I mentioned earlier, stakeholders believe that adaptation strategies are necessary when the impact of climate change will cause an economic loss in ports and wharves is actually, as based on our statistical results, is not accepted. And in fact, the results indicated that Chinese port stakeholders perceive that the consequence of climate change impact on their port and wharves will not become more severe. So impacts, yes, there will be some impacts, but we don't feel that with all these so-called climate change impacts, it will be more severe in terms of our port facilities or in our port operations. So some possible reasons that we try to explain, but I will come back to this point later. But because I first want to go to the second hypothesis but they do believe that adaptation strategies are necessary when the adaptation strategies would reduce the vulnerability of ports to climate change in the long term. So they feel that if there are real impacts on it, then I think we need to do some serious adaptation planning with some real adaptation strategies. The only question is that up to this point, among a lot of the Chinese ports, they don't think that such impacts are really impacting them, and certainly not on their time frame that they are doing the planning. And so what we try to do is that based on the results as mentioned, we also try to conduct a number of interviews to try to identify why do you come up with this type of results. And I think one very key finding that I would like to share with you is that actually quite a lot of them, I would say, not just some, a lot of them actually say, in terms of, we believe that there will be impact, but it doesn't seem to be severe. But whether it is severe or whether, to what extent, how we are going to adapt to plan, to do adaptation planning, first, we want to also know about what exactly is the national government's view on that. What is the national government's position on adaptation policy? And of course, in terms of the national government level, there's something on Chinese policy and action for addressing climate change, not a lot related to adaptation. A lot of them are about mitigation, carbon emission, etc. But then there are, so in fact, what happened is that at the national level, there are not really a lot of things talking about how to adapt, not helped by the fact that a lot of so-called adaptation issues are very local oriented. So a number of existing strategies by port that they are doing is, okay, we do have, we can propose something on enhanced infrastructure, elevation, porcelain, including the weights of cranes. So it's something that we can do, but what they do have in general is a kind of weight and attitude is, we know that potentially that can be a problem, but we want to wait for the government to tell us what to do. This is very different from, for example, from in North America, that this is never an issue asking about what the federal government would like to do, because simply that the governance system of ports in North America is simply that, as I mentioned, it's very much city-based or at most provincial or state-based. And so, of course, then it also comes to the question about, there have been a number of suggested solutions on how ports in North America can do in order to make ports more resilient. But is it actually applicable among Chinese port and Chinese port stakeholders? We don't know yet, because fundamentally, the governance system of port in China is different. But still, it comes to both sides. It comes to a very interesting phenomenon, is that they are trying to include things and try to address and mention about it in their plans. But in terms of implementation, it's still a little bit like everyone is hesitating. Should we commit? Should we not commit? I would describe it in some way as whenever the document is mentioned, things become a little bit stagnant. And so I think it seems that my presentation has created more questions and problems than trying to solve it. But I think what I can share with you today, as I mentioned, is that is the basic attitude of what Chinese port stakeholders are thinking in general about so-called adaptation strategies and adaptation planning, but also at the same time to what extent that it is related to the institutional and the governance system, and if it is related, then it's the research and it's the work that have been done in Europe, in North America, the way on how they are starting to propose a lot of things on so-called collaboration among the stakeholders, etc. Are they actually applicable to China? And I think this will be the next step for us for our research too. And so with the limitation of time, so probably I will just stop here and thank you very much.
To what extent are insurance companies taking account of climate risk and then pricing accordingly?
Unfortunately, no, up to this point, zero. And not just among Chinese ports, even I can actually give you, for example, Vancouver. They have an adaptation plan since 2010, and until today, no private terminals have provided even $1 of support on that. And I think the trend is that one of the major tricky part is it's difficult to actually convert it into explicit figures that they can actually do benchmarking. And so and given that what they need to do is in terms of their financial performance, that they have facing difficulty to actually justify any actions on that. So that is what they are facing at the moment.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm a bit surprised that we are looking at what the stakeholders will think in terms of profitability and risk management, etc., regarding the climate change, but do they also integrate in their process that maybe they should act or be part of actions against climate change and try to find a better process, try to be more innovative and know how. I mean, it's really the issue, but it looks like, okay, there is an issue, we try to fix it by not going to the root cause, but, and obviously the insurance issue will cost more. Nobody will want to insure natural storms like Sandy or typhoon that we may have, etc.
Thank you. And because I know the answer. Because so I think first, when we talk about stakeholder, of course, in this study, we are talking about stakeholders that are directly involved in the operation and development of the port. But when you talk about port stakeholders, it can also depend on, for example, urban community can be part of the port stakeholders too, but they're indirect. They're not directly related to the operation, so that's already one thing. Usually, the so-called any adaptation planning on this is start at the port authority level, that they try to initiate a plan. So, for example, in Canada, like Vancouver and San Diego, they do organize a number of workshops trying to get stakeholders involved and then try to have input on their plans. So the question is that first, it's not too difficult that they will have opinion and try and how it should plan. I think the difficulty comes whenever that now we have a plan, and now how we actually implement it, because what happened is that when you say in the port area, port is port is a port, but at the same time, its facilities, it also have impacts on, it also not just only on port facility, but also have impact on the coastal community, for example. And so what happened is that when it actually comes to the implementation part, suddenly a big difficulty, you found that a lot of the stakeholders, they suddenly would disappear from the scene because the worry is about, so if I am keeping very actively involved, am I going to be, do I actually need to commit both financially and technically into the planning? And there is actually a trend, there was actually, I have a paper which was published in the Journal of Environmental Planning and Management. What we found is that there's also a tendency that stakeholders try to come together and try to be innovative, but then when you come to the next stage, then everybody say they try to push the effort to the initiator, which is the port authority, that, okay, so probably it's time for you to take care about how to actually implement it. And in Vancouver, for example, what they actually try to do is that it comes to an extent that the whole coastal adaptation process is not just about the ports, because Vancouver itself, they always have the issues of flooding. So in some way, they talk a little bit more than just port planning, but also coastal infrastructure planning. And so a number of stakeholders, they were telling the Vancouver Port Authority that, so nice, I think you should try to actually do things to improve the coastal resilience of the whole city of Vancouver rather than the port area. But then the Port Authority simply say, come on, we not to mention about finance or anything, we don't even have the jurisdiction to actually do the planning for the whole municipality. So this is always the question about that. The next stage is that, in fact, in Canada, I have a long conversation with the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. This issue they actually caught quite some attention from the federal government now, that they have doing a so-called port modernization review. And what they recognize is that there have been too many issues, including climate adaptation issues, is that plans have been drawn out, but then probably that it's difficult. Everything, when it comes to with a document, everything becomes stagnant. And so they start to question also, is it necessary, or should we even consider about having a so-called a national port plan, or maybe have a more let's say a general or national policy direction, so as to actually push and take some initiative to push this to move forward. So I don't know how it will come out, but I think this is the issue. Thank you.